Room 408 at St. Joseph Medical Center had fallen into a kind of sacred stillness. Only the soft beeping of the heart monitor echoed through the dim light, marking the fading rhythm of Ravik Dornevale's heartbeat. At 64, his body was frail, worn down by years of service, loss, and silence. He lay still beneath a sterile hospital blanket, his eyes half-closed behind a surgical mask. But he wasn't alone. Lying across his chest, motionless but deeply present, was Varko, a powerful German shepherd whose eyes held the weight of something unspoken. Varko had come into Ravik's life a decade earlier, abandoned and bleeding by the side of an icy Wyoming highway. Ravik, a retired long-haul trucker and former Marine, hadn't hesitated to rescue him. Since then, they had shared every lonely mile together. Varko had been Ravik's anchor during nights when his memories of war and regret tried to drag him under. Now, as Ravik's body weakened, it was Varko who refused to let go. Draven Ashmore, the attending physician, had allowed an exception that night. No animals were usually permitted in ICU. But something in Silma Vexro's pleading eyes, the night nurse on duty, convinced him. She'd seen the way Varko laid his head across Ravik's chest and refused to move, like he was listening for a sound only he could hear. The hospital staff stood quietly at the door, watching with a kind of reverent hesitation. Then, without warning, the heart monitor let out a sharp, high-pitched alarm. Draven rushed in, followed by Silma and a second nurse, Tessen Voxbury. Ravik's breathing had slowed to a whisper, his eyes completely closed. But the monitor wasn't flatlining. In fact, it showed a flicker of chaotic rhythm, as if something deep inside was resisting the silence. Silma noticed first. The signal changed. The second Varko pressed into his chest. The dog hadn't moved, but a low, broken whine came from deep in his throat. Ravik's hand, still as stone just seconds before, twitched. Slowly, it curled toward Varko's thick fur, fingers barely brushing the animal's neck. No one dared speak. It was too fragile a moment. From the hallway, Caleth Brimlock, a quiet man in his 70s, watched through the glass. He whispered under his breath, "He's coming back." Whether it was science, instinct, or something beyond what medicine could name, no one could deny it. Something real, something powerful, had happened in that exact moment between a dying man and his dog. The hospital room had changed. The sterile, clinical air now felt charged, almost sacred. Draven Ashmore stood frozen beside Ravik's bed, his gloved hands hovering inches above the man's chest, unsure whether to continue the intervention or simply let the moment unfold. The irregular heartbeat on the monitor pulsed like a code, as if Ravik's body was fighting its own collapse. And through it all, Varko didn't flinch. He stayed pressed against Ravik's chest, his breathing slow, ears alert, as if tuned into something no one else could hear. Silma Vexro exchanged a silent glance with Tessen Voxbury, who was gripping the side rail of the bed. Tessen whispered, "That shouldn't be possible. His vitals were flatlining minutes ago." Silma nodded slowly. "I know, but look at Varko. It's like he's holding him here." The idea sounded ridiculous, but nothing about what they were witnessing felt normal. Varko's eyes remained locked on Ravik's face, like he was waiting for a response, refusing to believe this was goodbye. Outside the room, Caleth Brimlock leaned on his walker, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. He'd been admitted for a minor stroke the week before, but he'd always had a sense for moments that didn't make sense. The old man muttered, almost to himself, "That dog's not just watching. He knows." Caleth had seen enough in his life, war, death, grief, to recognize when something wasn't just medical. This wasn't survival. It was connection. Back inside, Draven finally lowered his hands. "We're not losing him tonight," he said, almost under his breath. Ravik's eyelids fluttered briefly. It was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Silma rushed to adjust his oxygen, while Tessen checked his pulse again. It was weak but present. The silence in the room wasn't quiet anymore. It was filled with awe. Varko shifted slightly, pressing his head harder against Ravik's chest. His body trembled, but his eyes never blinked. Then, without warning, Ravik's fingers curled just a bit tighter into Varko's fur. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, cutting a faint trail down his cheek. It wasn't just muscle reflex. It was emotion, consciousness. Something buried inside Ravik was coming back to the surface, and Varko had pulled it out. In the dim hallway, another figure watched now, Lunara Creel, head of administration. She'd been skeptical when she heard about the dog in the ICU. But now she stood silently, arms crossed, shaken. Something had begun in room 408 that no one could explain yet. And for the first time in years, Ravik Dornevale wasn't slipping further away. He was coming back. And no one knew why. Ravik stirred again, but not fully. His eyelids twitched. His fingers moved just slightly in Varko's thick fur, and the monitor beeped softly, irregular but steady. The ICU team had taken a step back, unsure if this was a fleeting moment or the beginning of something bigger. Silma Vexro adjusted the monitor settings quietly, while Draven Ashmore leaned in to observe Ravik's expression. It was tense, like a man locked in a dream he couldn't quite escape from. Varko hadn't moved from his post. He kept his head resting just over Ravik's heart, and his eyes scanned his face as if waiting for a signal. And then, Ravik whispered something, barely audible through the oxygen mask. Tessan had been refilling 4 fluids when she froze mid-step. Did he just say something? She asked, turning back. Silma nodded and leaned closer. There it was again. Faint, dry, cracked from disuse, but clear enough. Zayla? The name drifted into the room like smoke. Silma stepped back slowly. Who's Zayla? She asked quietly, her voice uncertain. Draven frowned. No one mentioned that name on his intake forms. No spouse, no next of kin, no emergency contacts at all. It was as if Ravik had come from nowhere, and now, a name from his past was breaking through. Calith Brimlock, still lingering outside the room, perked up at the name. His brow furrowed deeply. Zayla Thornridge, he muttered. The name hit something in him. Back in the 1980s, during his time as a postal worker in northern Montana, he remembered hearing it. Thornridge wasn't a common name. A woman, young, brilliant, troubled, had disappeared under strange circumstances in a small town near Ravik's old trucking routes. Calith wasn't sure it was the same Zayla, but the name stirred something unsettling. Inside, Draven watched as Ravik's heart rate slowly picked up. He's stabilizing. Still fragile, but definitely improving. He paused. It's like his body is responding to something deeper, memory, maybe. Emotion. Silma glanced down at Varko. Or love. Meanwhile, Lunara Creel was already reviewing Ravik's medical file again. It was thin, oddly thin. Too little history, too few records for a man in his 60s. No family listed. No previous addresses that tracked longer than 6 months. Just fragments. Inconsistencies. And now, one whispered name that didn't fit anywhere, except in Ravik's fading mind. Varko's ears perked up at the sound of Ravik's voice again. Another name. Another whisper. This time it wasn't Zayla. It was Mavrin. The ICU had settled into a strange rhythm. A mixture of cautious hope and quiet tension. Ravik Dornevale remained unconscious, but he was no longer fading. His vitals were stabilizing slowly, as if pulled back from the edge by invisible threads. Varko, still resting against his chest, hadn't moved once. Every nurse who passed the doorway glanced in, not just out of curiosity, but with reverence. Whatever was happening in room 408 no longer felt clinical. Felt personal. Lunara Creel, not one to believe in feelings, sat in her office poring over Ravik's file again. The name Mavrin Coldwin, whispered by a dying man who'd been off the grid for decades, struck something in her. She opened an archived federal search database, entering the name alongside Zayla Thornridge. The results took longer than usual to load, but when they did, her breath caught. Both names appeared, linked in a 1989 cold case from Wyoming. Disappearance. No bodies found. Only one suspect ever mentioned in passing. A long-haul driver known only as R. Dorn. Back in the ICU, Silma Vexro sat by the bedside, watching Ravik's face closely. Every few minutes, his lips moved slightly, fragments of words escaping like wind through a cracked window. She wrote them down. Lost, fire. She saw too much. And again, Zayla. None of it made sense yet, but it was more than she'd heard from him in weeks. She looked down at Varko. "You're the key, aren't you?" she whispered. "You remember it all, don't you?" Outside, Caliph Brimlock returned with something crumpled in his shaking hands. It was an old photo, aged and torn, edges yellowing. He handed it to Silma. "I've had this for years. Found it in a donation bin in Great Falls. Didn't know why I kept it. Until now." She unfolded it carefully. The photo showed 3 people. A younger Ravik, clean-shaven, smiling. A woman with striking black hair and cold eyes labeled Zayla. And a man with a sharp jawline, standing slightly behind them. The back read, "Brimstone Ridge, Summer '89." Mavrin took the picture. Tessan Voxberry stepped closer, recognizing Ravik instantly. "That's him, no doubt." But Lunara, who had just arrived with the printout of the cold case file, looked pale. "He's not just a man with no past. He's a man with a buried past. One someone clearly tried to erase." At that moment, Ravik moved again. His eyes opened for just a second, glassy, confused, but filled with something more than just pain. He looked straight at Silma and said one word clearly. "She's not dead." The air in room 408 felt heavier now. Not with despair, but with the weight of secrets pressing to the surface. Ravik Dornavale's sudden statement, "She's not dead," had stunned the room. Silma Vexro froze, searching his eyes for clarity, but they had already closed again. Yet something had changed. It was as if the veil between his past and the present had been torn slightly, and through that tear, a storm was about to pour in. Draven Ashmore, reviewing the cold case report from Lunara Creel, felt the pieces start to connect. The report detailed a missing woman, Zayla Thornridge, last seen at a rest stop outside Cody, Wyoming. She was traveling with a man named Mavrin Coldwin, a former military associate with a history of violence. Ravik's name had been mentioned once, unofficially, but never pursued. There had been no evidence, just rumors, and one anonymous statement claiming, "The dog saw everything." That detail had been dismissed, but now it couldn't be. In the hallway, Caliph Brimlock stared at the photo once again. The moment captured in that sunlit summer image now seemed frozen in time for a reason. "That wasn't just a friendship," he murmured. "It was a triangle, and someone didn't make it out alive." Caliph remembered vague headlines back then. Missing hikers, unconfirmed sightings, whispers of an affair turned violent. Now, decades later, Ravik's body was failing, but his mind was refusing to let go of what it never confessed. Back in the ICU, Varko suddenly rose from Ravik's chest. His ears pricked and his posture alert. His body pointed toward the door before anyone heard it. Footsteps approaching. A woman in her late 50s entered, escorted by security. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her features were unmistakable. Zayla Thornridge, alive, older, changed, but her eyes, the same piercing intensity from the photograph. Silma and Draven exchanged stunned glances. Lunara stepped forward, demanding answers. Zayla raised a hand calmly. "I came because I heard Ravik was dying." Her voice cracked. "And because I need to know if he remembers what really happened that night." Her gaze turned toward Varko. "I saw the dog in a photo online. That's how I knew it was time." Ravik stirred again, as if her presence had awakened something buried deep in his chest. His lips moved, trembling. One word escaped, almost lost beneath the monitor's beeping. "Mavrin," he whispered. Varko growled low, ears pinned back. The name hung in the air like smoke. Mavrin. For a moment no one breathed. Zayla Thornridge's face went pale, and Varko growled again, deep and guttural, a sound that echoed with memory. Ravik, still weak, opened his eyes just enough to look at her. His mouth moved slowly, carefully forming words as if each one weighed 100 pounds. "He didn't fall. I pushed him. Gasps spread through the room like ripples in water. Draven Ashmore immediately stepped forward, trying to keep Ravik calm. "You're still recovering. You need to slow down." But Ravik shook his head, barely. He wasn't going to leave this world with the truth buried. He had her cornered. She was screaming. "I had no choice." Zayla looked down, her hands trembling. "I don't remember screaming. I don't remember that night. Just the fire." Her eyes welled up, and she turned toward Caliph Brimlock, who was still holding the old photograph. "We were camping at Brimstone Ridge. It was supposed to be a reunion, but something changed in Mavrin. He snapped."
Caliph nodded slowly. The fire destroyed half the forest that summer. Everyone thought it was an accident, but they never found Mavrin's body. His voice lowered. "Only rumors. That maybe he vanished into the woods, or something worse." Zayla closed her eyes. "We ran. We didn't speak. We both knew no one would believe us." Her voice cracked. Especially not two broken veterans with a dog as the only witness. Lunara Creel, now piecing it all together, whispered, "So you disappeared. Both of you." Zayla nodded. Ravik wanted to confess. "I didn't. I was afraid. I made him promise to vanish with me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't know it would destroy him like this." Varko stepped forward, placing his front paws on the edge of Ravik's bed, his eyes locked onto Zayla's. It was as if he understood everything. Ravik reached up, with great effort, and touched Varko's neck. "He never forgot. He kept the memory when I tried to forget it." His eyes filled with tears. "I thought I saved you, Zayla. But I wasn't sure. Not for years." Zayla stepped closer to him, her hand gently covering his. "You did save me, and I've been running from that night ever since." Her voice trembled. "But maybe it's time we stop running." Ravik closed his eyes, not in pain, but in peace. For the first time in decades, the truth was no longer hiding. The hospital room had grown quiet again, but not empty. The silence now was dense, filled with the echoes of truth finally spoken. Ravik Dornevale lay still, his breathing shallow but steady, his hand still resting on Varko's fur. Across the room, Zayla Thornridge hadn't moved. She stared at him as if she were seeing him again for the first time. Not the broken man in the bed, but the one who had stood between her and a nightmare so many years ago. Silma Vexro remained near the monitors, though her eyes kept drifting toward the window. "He's stabilized again," she said softly. "His vitals look better than they have in days." But even her clinical tone couldn't mask the tremor in her voice. She'd heard patients speak through delirium before, but this wasn't that. Ravik wasn't drifting through dreams. He was dragging himself through memory, pulling the truth out with every breath. Draven Ashmore stepped outside the room with Lunara Creel and Caliph Brimlock, who still held the old photo tightly. "This isn't just about what happened at Brimstone Ridge," Draven said. "It's about what it did to them afterward." Lunara nodded. "You bury a secret like that for decades. It doesn't stay buried. It eats you from the inside." Calitha's voice was low. "Or worse, it passes on to those around you." Back inside, Varko moved for the first time in hours. He stepped away from Ravik's bed and sat directly in front of Zayla. His eyes met hers. It wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper: accusation, sorrow, maybe even forgiveness. She knelt slowly, resting a hand on his head. "You never forgot, did you?" she whispered. "You were there. You saw everything." Her voice cracked. "And you carried it all these years." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she continued. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought silence would keep us both safe. But maybe it just kept us trapped." Varko leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. He wasn't just a pet. He had been a witness, a companion, and a keeper of guilt too heavy for either of them to hold alone. Ravik stirred again, his voice barely audible. He knew before I did. He never let me forget. Zayla turned back to him. You didn't fail, Ravik. You saved us both. For the first time in years, the truth had been spoken aloud, and the room, once a space of fading life, now held something else entirely. Healing. Morning light crept into room 408, casting long shadows across the floor. For the first time in days, Ravik Dornevale looked awake, not just physically, but fully aware. His eyes moved between Zayla Thornridge, who now sat beside his bed, and Varco, who lay quietly at his feet. The weight of what had been said the night before hung in the air. The truth was out, but the past never lets go so easily. Zayla hadn't slept. Her mind kept replaying the fire, the shouting, the sound of breaking branches, and Mavrin Coldwind's final scream. She had convinced herself for years that burying the memory was the only way to survive. But now, with Ravik broken in front of her and Varco silently watching, she knew survival without truth had been a prison. We can't undo it, she said softly, but maybe we can stop letting it own us. Down the hall, Lunara Creel was on the phone with law enforcement. The cold case had never been closed, just forgotten. But now, with a confession, a witness, and a living person once presumed dead, everything had changed. I understand, she said, voice firm. Yes, we'll cooperate fully. When she hung up, her hands shook. She wasn't used to managing miracles or murder investigations. Draven Ashmore joined her outside Ravik's room, reading her expression instantly. They're coming, aren't they? Lunara nodded. Local PD and a federal rep. Probably just want statements for now. But once the press gets wind of this, her words trailed off. Draven looked back at the room. He's not the same man from that file. But he doesn't get to walk away from it either. Inside, Varco stood and walked to the window. His posture was alert. A soft growl rose in his throat. Moments later, there was a knock on the hospital's main entrance. Tessan Voxberry, returning for her shift, saw the two plainclothes officers step inside and immediately understood. The past had caught up. Zayla stood as if she'd been expecting it. I'll tell them everything, she said. But you need to know, Ravik didn't kill Mavrin out of hate. He did it to save me. Ravik's voice was hoarse but steady. If they take me, let them. I'm not running any more. His eyes found Varco's, then Zayla's. I've already been in prison, my own mind, for 35 years. He took a long breath. If this is what freedom costs, I'm ready to pay. The conference room on the hospital's lower floor felt colder than the ICU. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and a folder marked Brimstone Ridge Incident, reopened, sat in front of Detective Jorik Nightram, who had driven in from Cheyenne just after sunrise. His tone was calm, but his presence carried weight. He'd seen enough in his career to recognize when a case was about more than just law. It was about legacy, guilt, and the kind of silence that rots lives from the inside. Across the table sat Zayla Thornridge, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her voice didn't shake this time. I lied for 35 years. I said Mavrin disappeared. I let people believe Ravik had nothing to do with it. But the truth is, Ravik saved me. And I told him to bury it because I couldn't live with the shame. Jorik studied her face, then turned his gaze to the dog lying quietly at her feet. That animal's not just a pet, is he? She shook her head. He saw it all. He never forgot. None of us did.
Ravik Dornevale, though still weak, had insisted on walking to the room with help from Draven Ashmore and Caliph Brimlock. He didn't want to speak from a hospital bed. He sat across from Jorik and opened with no hesitation. I pushed Mavrin. He hit his head. The fire was an accident, but the fight was real. I should have reported it. But I didn't. That's on me. There was no dramatic plea, no excuses. Just truth. Jorik closed the file slowly. Statute of limitations on involuntary manslaughter in Wyoming is 20 years. You passed that marker a long time ago. Ravik blinked in disbelief. So, that's it. The detective leaned back. Legally? Maybe. But justice doesn't always live in courtrooms. You lived with this for decades. That's a sentence all its own. After the meeting, the three of them, Ravik, Zayla, and Varko, returned to room 408. Silma met them at the door with a quiet smile. So? Ravik just nodded. I'm not going to prison, he said. But I'm not innocent either. Zayla touched his arm gently. None of us are. But maybe now we're free. Varko climbed back onto the bed beside Ravik, resting his head once more near the man's chest. There was no tension in his body now. Only calm. Ravik whispered. You carried it all for me, didn't you, boy? Varko didn't move. He didn't need to. Ravik finally understood. For the first time in 35 years, the weight was no longer his alone. 2 weeks later, room 408 was empty. The bed was freshly made, the machines unplugged, and the silence that lingered there was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. Ravik Dornevale had been discharged that morning, stepping out of the hospital with slow, steady movements, assisted only by Varko at his side. The sun was rising over Michigan, golden and warm, as if the world itself had exhaled with him. Zayla Thornridge waited near the curb, holding a paper cup of coffee and a small duffel bag. She watched as Ravik approached, one hand on Varko's harness, the other tucked into his coat pocket. She smiled soft but real. You look lighter, she said. Ravik nodded. I feel it. For the first time in decades, he wasn't running from shadows. He was walking into the light with the one soul who had never left him behind. They drove north, away from the city, toward a cabin Ravik hadn't visited in over 30 years. Nestled on the edge of Brimstone Ridge, it had been abandoned since the night of the fire. It wasn't just a return, it was a reckoning. When they arrived, the air smelled of pine and ash, and the wind moved through the trees like a whisper from the past. Varko stepped out first, nose lifted, tail steady. He knew this place. Inside the cabin, time had stood still. Dust clung to every surface, but the photos on the wall, faded, blurred, told stories of what once was. Ravik placed a framed picture of Mavrin, Zayla, and himself on the mantel. No more hiding. No more pretending it didn't happen. We lived, he said quietly, and we paid the price. Zayla added, but now we heal. That night they lit a fire, not to destroy, but to remember. They sat in silence for hours, watching the flames dance. Varko lay between them, finally at ease. Ravik turned to Zayla and whispered, You know, I used to wonder if he was just loyal, or if he actually understood. She looked at the dog, then at Ravik. I think he remembered, so we wouldn't have to carry it alone. As dawn approached, Ravik stood outside with Varko by his side. The horizon was soft and golden. We made it, he said, kneeling beside the dog. You brought me back. Varko pressed his head gently against Ravik's chest, just as he had in the hospital, and closed his eyes, not out of sorrow, but peace.